Well, welcome back, and a particularly warm welcome to Dr. Lydia Jaeger, who is going to talk to us this afternoon on the idea of law in science and religion. Dr. Jaeger is lecturer and academic dean at, this is testing me now, at the Institut Biblique de Nogent-sur-Marne, which is an international evangelical Bible college near Paris. After completing postgraduate studies in physics and mathematics at the University of Cologne, and in theology at the Seminary for Evangelical Theology in Vaux-sur-Seine. She took up this position. She did a PhD in philosophy at the Sorbonne on the possible links between the concept of law and religious presuppositions. She is an associate member of St Edmund's College under the Faraday Institute. She comes to Cambridge quite often, I think, to do some research. And she is now concentrating on the training of religious leaders to develop the way they interact with the issues, the philosophies of atheism and scientism, and doing research on natural order, the epistemological and ethical implications of the doctrine of creation, and the theology of science. So immensely well qualified to talk to us on this subject this afternoon. Thank you, Lydia.
Thank you for this introduction, which was too generous, but nevertheless, thank you. I do apologize for my English. I think I have a good excuse, but because if I'm not wrong, I'm the only non-native English speaker on the summer course. But I still hope that you is speaker, no, not participant. But I still hope that I'll be able to communicate to you clearly. For many, a central task of science is the discovery and formulation of the laws of nature. This characterization of the scientific enterprise, although almost a commonplace today, is nevertheless of recent origin, more or less contemporarily with the birth of modern science. It originated in the 17th century, when the leaders of the scientific revolution liked to describe their procedures as a break from Greek science, as transmitted by the medieval scholastics. Laws of nature were introduced as a rival explanation of natural phenomena, which was meant to replace the Aristotelian categories. In my talk, I want to explore the characteristics of the modern concept of natural law, explain its possible biblical and theological roots, and ask in how far this background can assist a renewed understanding of the scientific concept. So my first point, from Aristotelian natures to laws of nature. Laws of nature were introduced during the scientific revolution in order to replace the Aristotelian concepts of substances and qualities, which up to that date had been used to explain natural order. My aim is not to teach you Greek or medieval science. Thus, I will not provide a full definition of these Aristotelian concepts. May it suffice to say that the older approach to nature used substantial forms, that is a kind of innate, necessary force driving the motion of each particular thing. The fathers of modern science thought that these kind of explanations are deficient, are not valid. These older concepts were seen as obscurantist metaphysical constructs, allowing for no empirical control. The rhetoric against occult qualities was such a common theme that it was even echoed in the literature of the time. In a memorable scene from The Hypochondriac, Molière describes how a medical intern is warmly applauded by his superiors after explaining the somnolent effects of opium by recalling its virtus dormitiva, its dormitive virtue, that is, its capacity to make you sleep. which is in fact no explanation at all. To explain the behavior of things in terms of their natures, which we cannot explore empirically, appears as the medieval paradigm of obscurantism, from which the enlightenment of the new natural philosophy would free us. Rather than invoking substantial principles in order to explain natural phenomena, the new philosophers utilized legal metaphors. The writings of Robert Boyle, the father of modern chemistry, provide us with interesting examples. Take silver, for example, and its malleability. Robert Boyle rejects the idea that a piece of metal is malleable by virtue of a substantial principle. The action of an outside agent, a hammer, for example, can just as easily rob the object of its malleability as another, fire, for example, can give it. Thus, malleability is not a part of the nature of silver, but the behavior of the metal is governed by natural law. So I quote Robert Boyle, "The accidents spoken of are introduced into the matter by the agents or efficient causes, whatever they be. And these accidents being once thus introduced into the matter, we need not seek for a new substantial principle to preserve them there, since by the general law or common cause of nature, the matter qualified by them must continue in the state such accidents have put it into, till some agent or other it be forcibly put out of it, and so divested of those accidents." Rather than attributing natural phenomena to the intrinsic nature of things, Boyle explains them in reference to the law laid down by the sovereign action of God. In the same vein, Descartes replaces the scholastic concepts with the laws of nature in order to explain the presence of order in the world. The transition is particularly evident in one of his writings, Le Monde, which was written during the early 1630s, but only published after his death. In chapter 6 of this work, Descartes invites the reader to imagine a world for which matter allows a geometric description, but which would be entirely devoid of form in the scholastic sense of the word. The goal of this exercise is, of course, to convince the reader that such a world is not imaginary, but is in fact the very world in which we live. Yet, the abolition of the categories traditionally used for the explanation of natural phenomena and the introduction of geometric notion of matter creates the problem of explaining the order and regularity in nature. The geometric objects of the Cartesian world move, but they move arbitrarily. The introduction of laws of nature serves precisely as a remedy for this problem. They secure the transition from chaos to the harmonious world that we know. To quote Descartes, "For God has so marvelously established these laws that while we had supposed that he creates nothing more than what I said, and even that he put in this neither order nor proportion, but that he composes chaos, the most confused and the most tangled that the poets could describe. They, the laws of nature, are sufficient to cause the parts of this chaos to untangle themselves, and ready themselves in such good order that they will have the form of a very perfect world, and in which one sees not only light, but also all the other things, from the general to the particular, that inhabit this real world." Other scholars, from the same time period follow the exactly same transition from substantial forms to laws of nature. Next to John Locke, for example, one must cite Isaac Newton. Insofar as his adoption of this manner of designating the natural order serves as the definitive sign of victory over earlier conceptions. At the beginning of his major work, the Principia, he writes, "The moderns, having rejected substantial forms and occult qualities, have undertaken to bring back the phenomena of nature to mathematical laws." Instead of substantial forms, mathematical laws. Newton is very clear that you can't give an exclusively immanent explanation of the movement. The motions are, according to Newton, the motions which the planets now have could not spring from any natural cause alone, but were impressed by an intelligent agent. In my second point, I want to turn now to the idea of natural law in the Hebrew Bible. Because without any doubt, European civilization received the idea of created laws of nature from the biblical scriptures, and in particular from their Hebrew section. It is therefore useful to present the biblical data in some detail, before going on to explore the new meaning that the long-known idea of created laws of nature took on in the 17th century. From the very beginning, the Bible presents an objective order in nature. Already the first chapter of Genesis shows us the creation of a cosmos, of an ordered world. For example, the act of creation is structured in 6 days. The plants and animals are created each according to its kind. The text particularly stresses the theme of separation between light and darkness, sky and earth, water and dry land. The divine word plays a particularly important role. 10 times the account refers to the word which births a structured creation. The divine act of creation encounters no obstacles, in stark contrast with other creation accounts of the time. Whereas in the Babylonian story, the world exists as a result of a battle between the gods, the monotheism of Genesis shows us a creative work that doesn't meet with the least resistance, such that God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. God's mighty work in creation led to an ordered universe. The prologue of the Gospel of John echoes the first chapter of Genesis by attributing the title of Logos, Greek for word, reason, to the Christ, and thus highlighting his role in creation. In the beginning was the Word. Everything was made by him. Without him, nothing was made. The conviction of living in an ordered world resurfaces in other parts of the biblical canon. His faith in the God of wisdom gives the believer the assurance that he lives in an ordered world. The wisdom literature is particularly rich on this level. The Lord's first discourse to Job opens with a comparison of the act of creation with the construction of a building. He highlights the stability and precision of the divine work. The solidity of the foundation of the earth is a recurring theme in the Psalms. The eternal reigns, therefore the world is firm, it does not waver. In the midst of adversity, the believer finds consolation in the immutability of the natural order, guaranteed by God Himself. To cite once again the Psalms, "Forever, Lord, your word is established in the heavens. Your faithfulness endures from generation to generation. You founded the earth, and it holds firm. Because of your judgment, they remain standing even today, for the whole universe is your servant." The laws that the Creator gave to natural phenomena are even described quantitatively. He determined the weight of the wind and fixed the measure of the waters. When He determined a law for the rain and a trajectory for the lightning and thunder, He saw wisdom and rendered it manifest. He established it and sounded it. To quote Job again. As among the peoples neighboring Israel, the sea symbolizes the forces of chaos. Several passages stress the limits imposed on the sea, as well as the laws that even the waves must obey. Thus speaks wisdom personified in the book of Proverbs. The Lord possessed me at the beginning of His activity, before His most ancient works. When He made firm the skies, I was there. When He traced a circle on the surface of the abyss. When He strengthened the clouds from above, when the springs of the abyss showed their power. When He established His order for the sea, that the waters might not disobey His commandment, when He arranged the foundations of the earth. Then I was before Him, like a master workman. I was daily His delight, rejoicing before Him always. To say that the sea is subject to the order instituted at creation is to affirm the universality of that order. Certain biblical passages explicitly express the conviction that the laws of creation are universal, such as the text quoted before from Psalm 119. Because of your judgment, they remain standing even today, for the whole universe is your servant. From these biblical data, it follows that there is no conflict between God's sovereignty and natural order. The active omnipotence and omnipresence of God does not in the least endanger the created order. Certainly, as creator, God retains complete mastery, such that the usual course of things can in no way limit His action. But even if going beyond the natural order remains possible, such a miracle has to be read against the background of a creation that is ordered and kept in existence as such. Thus it is unacceptable to see in the laws of nature nothing more than God's customs or habits, to reduce the natural order to a mere series of acts that God performs with a certain regularity. As God is the sovereign creator in whom everything lives and moves and has its being, there is no need to suppress the creation's power to act in order to better celebrate divine sovereignty. Far from threatening the authentic existence of the created, the divine power provides its very foundation. The concept of creation allows us to resist the antithesis between divine action and natural order. There is no conflict between God's power, His sovereign reign, and the efficiency of natural law, as He Himself upholds the whole of creation. In the biblical worldview, the natural order expresses the divine faithfulness and wisdom. The work of creation testifies that the Lord is not a God of disorder, but of peace. The universality of this order springs from monotheism. As the Lord alone is God, nothing and no one is able to take away from his omnipotence. Whereas polytheistic gods are incapable of structuring the universe, since they are mere replicas of the world, the one true God unites in himself attributes that are often dissociated. He is simultaneously wise and powerful. Thus, there is no obstacle that can keep him from instituting the order that he, in his wisdom, has determined. In this manner, recognizing the transcendent God caused the biblical authors to understand the world as an ordered unit, linked in all its parts, as well as marked with the imprint of the same will. I now want to come back to the concept of natural laws as it was introduced in the sciences in the early modern times. I want to show in particular how the biblical concept of universal laws imposed by God's will was put to good use during the scientific revolution. So my next point is on universal laws versus intrinsic natures. In fact, the notion of creation as present in the Bible provides a relevant background for the understanding of the modern concept of laws of nature, as it was developed during the scientific revolution. Of course, the 17th century authors were not the first to take up the biblical metaphors of laws in connection with nature. It can already be found in some medieval and early modern authors. Similar expressions are even used by some Stoic writers, especially in Latin. But the similarity of vocabulary does not necessarily indicate a fundamental agreement. Not only have we to wait until the 17th century before the expression of law becomes the customary way of designating the ordinary course of nature, but in particular, its sense has been profoundly altered. In the earlier sources, it suggested the orientation intrinsic to each species, whereas its modern use indicates the universal order imposed from without. Thus, the transition from substantial forms to laws of nature was characterized by the abandon of a hierarchical worldview. No longer the existing objects were placed on a scale reaching from the lowest existing things to human beings, angels, up to the divine, each entity following its own nature. The new philosophers of science adopted a conception of the world characterized by a fundamental asymmetry: the creator on one hand and the whole created realm on the other. As a result, the same law could regulate all natural phenomena which depend together on divine providence. Alexandre Koyré, historian of science, summarizes incisively the two conceptions in the following terms. First, the medieval view, say the Greek and medieval view, the cosmos, closed unity of a hierarchical order. And the modern view, a universe, open ensemble, linked by the unity of its laws. Others have expressed the difference between the two visions by means of the opposition between biological and artisanal conceptions. For the Greeks, nature is an animal that generates its movement by an inherent vital principle. In the modern view, nature is an artifact of the Lord who assigns creation the form he chooses. This difference in outlook is no theoretical speculation which would not have any practical consequences. It rather influences directly the type of natural science you aim at. Let me show you several of these consequences. First, if all things are created, they are, in a certain sense, all artifacts. Thus, it would be inappropriate to exclude, as Aristotle would have it, the artifacts of the operation of ordinary laws. Modern science treats for sure human artifacts as subject to the same laws as natural beings. Second, and perhaps more importantly, the Aristotelians' distinction between natural movement and violent movement must be abandoned. You may not be familiar with this distinction, so let me explain it to you. Aristotle held that each body in the universe has a fixed place, which corresponds to its nature. If an entity finds itself separated from its natural place, it will naturally return to this place. For example, heavy things naturally seek to approach the earth. Once there, they remain at rest. Other phenomena break with this natural order. They are animated by a violent movement. Only the second type of movement against nature demands a causal explanation requiring the intervention of an exterior agent, the motor, whereas the natural movement simply proceeds from the nature of the object. Modern physics has abandoned the Aristotelian distinction between natural and violent movement. It considers instead that the ensemble of kinematic phenomena is ruled by the same universal laws of mechanics. Such a perspective resonates with the vision of a created world submitted in its entirety to the providential action of God. The Bible does distinguish orders of events, but the distinction is not between natural and violent movement. It is between the order of creation and the order of redemption. It follows that the ordinary course of things encompasses that which Aristotle calls natural and violent movements. Only the miracles are put aside, since they do not come under general providence, but rather play a pivotal role in the history of redemption, which aims at restoring that which evil has destroyed in the created world. A third consequence. In the perspective of laws assigned to nature, it becomes possible to envisage global constraints. It is often not noticed that one needs such constraints, global constraints, in Newtonian mechanics. For example, you need to postulate the conservation of energy for the whole universe in order to secure determinism. Local laws will not do the job. It is more obvious that modern physics needs forces of interaction that depend on the relative distance between two objects. But such conceptions were unimaginable to Aristotle, for whom every change needed to be explained in terms of properties of entities considered individually. For substantial forms are based on the place in itself and on the inherent properties of things, and these are individual categories. Exterior circumstances and global constraints cannot intervene in this context. Needless to say, all of these diverse facets of the new perspective were essential to the elaboration of the modern approach to physics in the 17th century. It is not possible to do modern physics based on the old Greek notions of substantial forms. You need natural laws. I want to make one step further and show how the new experimental method depended also on the new concept of laws of nature created by God. In the 17th century view, natural order is no longer seen as necessary, but as freely willed. It is the result of the free action of creation, whereas Aristotelian forms are linked to the essences of things and thus are necessary. Coming back to Robert Boyle, he writes, for example, the laws of motion, without which the present state and cause of things could not be maintained, did not necessarily spring from the nature of matter, but depended upon the will of the divine author of things. Newton's writings reflect a very similar conviction. The divine action in nature is contingent. Thus he writes, the world might have been otherwise than it is. 'Twas therefore no necessary, but a voluntary and free determination that it should be thus. In this way, Newton opposes his rival Leibniz's approach to nature, which he judges overly rational. Roger Coates, who oversaw the publication of the second edition of Principia, is a spokesman of Newton's point of view when he writes in the preface that the laws of nature proceed from the free will of God. They demonstrate, I quote, many traces indeed of the most wise contrivance, but not the least shadow of necessity. These, therefore, we must not seek from uncertain conjectures, but learn them from observations and experiments. He who would claim to rationally deduce the sciences, I quote again, must either suppose that the world exists by necessity, and by the same necessity follows the laws proposed, or if the order of nature was established by the will of God, that himself, a miserable reptile, can tell what was fittest to be done. These quotes show that Newton's empiricism is closely linked to the idea of voluntary creation. In contrast to other conceptions of the world's origins, creation lies the emphasis on divine sovereignty and omnipotence. God can do all that he pleases. It follows that the natural order is not necessary, but contingent. God was under no obligation to create the world, nor to give it the form that he decided to give it. As a result, purely rational speculation cannot discover the laws that rule nature, as if all creation were merely a question of pure logic. Man must not lose touch with nature if he is to discover the order that God freely decided to create. I quote Michael Foster, "The element in nature which depends upon the voluntary activity of God is incapable of becoming an object to reason, and science therefore must depend, in regard to this element, upon the evidence of sensation. The reliance upon the senses for evidence, not merely for illustration, is what constitutes the empirical character peculiar to modern natural science, and the conclusion follows that only a created nature is proper object of an empirical science." But liberty does not necessarily imply arbitrary will. The divine sovereignty is not blind despotism. God creates with wisdom, in such a way that human beings can discover a natural order which appears coherent. Let me once again quote Foster. It is Christian to ascribe to God an activity of will, but it is not Christian to deny to God a theoretical activity or to ascribe to him a blind activity of will. It is a consequence of the Christian doctrine of creation that the created world must contain an element of contingency, not that it must be nothing but contingent. Science depends on both elements, experimentation and reflection. Only their union can give birth to the scientific understanding of nature. Thus, the biblical worldview, with its central notion of creation, provides the framework for the experimental method of modern science. Thus, it is not surprising to see that for Newton, the idea of voluntary creation helped him to adopt the modern methodology of empirical science. Thus, we can not only detect a conceptual link between the idea of creation and the pivotal role of experience in modern science, but we see that the biblical worldview has contributed historically to the birth of science in the 17th century, at least in this very important aspect. In my last and final section, I want to persuade you that laws imposed from outside are certainly important for modern science, but that they are probably not enough. You must retain at least some insights from the older view of natures. Creation, once again, provides us with a stimulating framework which allows us to hold together laws of nature and some, not all, aspects of natures. Now, compared to the rest of my talk, this section is rather tentative, and I'm more than happy to hear your critiques. Although the replacement of substantial forms by laws constituted an important step in the elaboration of the interpretive framework of modern science, one must recognize that the concept of law is not without its difficulties. The problem of laws, said to be ceteris paribus, can serve as an example of the sort of difficulties one encounters. Let me explain to you what is meant by ceteris paribus. Alors, ceteris paribus, literally, all other things being equal. In fact, when we speak about ceteris paribus laws, we point to the fact that the majority of laws, perhaps even all laws that we know today, are idealizations. They describe not situations that occur in real life, but rather apply to very specific circumstances, ideal, as it were, and typically include, even in this laboratory context, approximations. They are only true ceteris paribus, all other things being equal. To give an example, the law of Coulomb stipulates that two electrified spheres will approach each other with an acceleration inversely proportional to the square of their relative distance, as long as nothing bears their way, and atmospheric resistance is left out, and they are not magnetized, and they are not too close to each other so that atomic forces can be disregarded, etc., etc. Given the diversity of the disregarded perturbing factors, it is impossible to compose a complete list. One may therefore wonder how all F are G, ceteris paribus, differs from all F are G, except in the cases where F is not G, which is hardly an enlightening information. One solution to the problem is to consider that the laws hold true only for idealized objects and situations. But the reasons for which the laws of science permit us to orient our activity in real life become mysterious on such a view. For concrete applications invariably imply less than ideal conditions. Another more promising solution to the problem of finding a satisfactory formulation of ceteris paribus laws is the introduction of the concept of disposition. A disposition describes the tendency to do a particular action or to act in a certain way. The disposition is thus present even in situations where other factors perturb its actual operation. If the law is about dispositions, it can be valid even if circumstances are not ideal, even in those circumstances which prevent the activation of the disposition. As the modern concept of laws emerged from the vision of the world as created by God, the question arises whether this kind of dispositions can be reconciled with creation. In answer to this question, it is very important to observe that according to the biblical view, divine sovereignty should not be opposed to the creature's power to act, where the power to act is a certain kind of disposition inherent in the thing itself. As the creative act is constitutive of the creatures, the fact that they receive everything from God is the very reason of their capacity to act. The radical dependency of the creatures on their creator provides the very basis of their causal powers. Thus, there is no point to clinging stubbornly to the alternative, that either something act according to its nature, or else it follows a law imposed upon it by an exterior authority. The notion of creation allows us to harmonize law and a certain conception of inherent natures. Because the law given by the Lord is precisely what makes it the nature of the creature. Divine action is not exterior, but rather constitutes its very being. Let me quote Calvin on this. All species have some secret conduct, according to which their nature requires it, as if they obey a perpetual statute to which God has constrained them. And thus that which God once decreed flows and carries along as from a voluntary inclination. Thus, occasionalism, as put forward, for example, by Nicolas Malebranche or George Berkeley, cannot claim to be biblically grounded. The sovereign exercise of God's will does not annihilate created causal powers, so that it is wrong to consider that the only efficient action is divine. The opposition between laws imposed by sovereign decision and the inherent natural order is foreign to the biblical view. The two poles, divine action and established order, are mutually dependent and cannot be understood separately. Therefore, the biblical authors often evoke them side by side without suggesting the least conflict. I'm not giving you the biblical quotes here, just a summary from a Dutch theologian, Gerrit Berkhouwer, who summarizes the biblical conception of natural order in the following words. The problem of first and second causes is not experienced as a real difficulty. Israel too knows of conception and birth, of streams that go to the sea, and of the cycle of nature. But this knowledge does not stifle her Thou, O Lord. In her knowledge, she still looks to the living God, the unchangeable. This is no primitive religious naivety that later is sloughed off with increase of intelligence. The voice of Jehovah cleaveth the flames of fire. The voice of Jehovah shaketh the wilderness. The voice of Jehovah maketh the hinds to cough. This is Israel's understanding of natural events, for Israel's eyes are trained on him. Clearly, it is not by chance that the idea of creation has played a decisive role in the formation of the modern concept of natural laws. We find it in Descartes' thought, where Descartes was one of the key figures in elaborating the modern concept of law, together with Newton. In fact, Descartes shows on this point the influence of Augustinianism, which precisely emphasizes the harmony of the two poles of the biblical vision. The philosopher wrote in 1630 to Mersenne that mathematical truths are created. He wrote, God established these laws of nature in the same way as a king establishes laws in his kingdom. What is more, God put them in our souls, and I quote again, as a king would inscribe his laws in the hearts of all his subjects if he were able to do it. In a letter to Newcastle in April 1648, Descartes compares these innate ideas to graces. They are given to us gratuitously. In the Augustinian vision, grace does not constrain the human being, but it impregnates his will in such a way that he himself seeks salvation. In the same way, providence has nothing to do with a capricious or unpredictable rule, but rather finds expression in the stability of the natural order. Therefore, the idea of creation allows us to retain some insights provided by the language of natures, in addition to the concept of law. Please don't misunderstand me. Aristotelian natures do not regain establishment in a created world. It is true that divine action is constitutive of the creature, in that the laws established by God compose, as it were, an integral part of the nature of the creature. But these laws do not ensue from this nature, as was the case for substantial forms in Aristotelian-inspired science. Thus, the natures of created things are contingent. As a result, it follows that the scientist cannot rely on his reason alone to discern natural order. He must go and see that which God freely decided to create. And this corresponds to the empirical approach favored by the new science. It remains true, however, that the Lord, as Descartes puts it, is the author of the essence as well as of the existence of creature. To see natural law an exterior constraint, arbitrary and unrelated to the nature of things, would maintain an antinomy that has no place in the biblical worldview. Creation thus allows the re-evaluation of the concept of natural laws and constitutes a promising starting point in order to develop a solution to problems that are implied by the notion of law, despite the many advantages offered by this modern concept. As for the idea that laws are only valid ceteris paribus, the theological framework of creation authorizes the recognition of causal powers of natural agents, without falling back into a conception of necessary natures which would fuse the properties and the essence of the thing. It is true that creation only furnishes the interpretive framework. the epistemological analysis of ceteris paribus laws remains to be done. But this, in a way, invalidates theological reflections. To expect to find a philosophical account revealed ipso facto by the doctrine of creation would be to confuse religious discourse and philosophy. Nevertheless, the writings of several protagonists of modern science testify to the fecundity of the interpretive framework which the scholar finds in his religious vision of the world. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lydia. Now, questions for Dr. Jaeger? Yep. We'll wait for the mic.
Look, thanks for that talk, Lydia. I think you're exactly right to say that the modern conception of laws of nature starts in the 17th century, and it starts as a consequence of a rejection of Aristotelian intrinsic properties, and it starts with people like Descartes and Boyle and Newton. I guess the question I have goes to the trajectory of this conception, though, and I think what you're suggesting is that there's a biblical notion of laws of nature that's somehow reapplied in the early modern period, and that accounts for this view. And that's where my question is directed. I think whether there is such a thing as a biblical view about this is perhaps something we could ask about. But it seems to me you could construct it somewhat differently if you look, for example, at Genesis, where God says, let the earth bring forward living things and so on. What this suggests is that God gives nature a certain agency of itself. And the trajectory of that, I see, is linked to the Stoic conception of the immanent properties of nature. It's linked to the Stoic and Augustinian ideas about seminal principles that are intrinsic to the natural world. And this seems to me a Christianised version of an immanent nature's view that's going to mesh quite neatly with Aristotelianism. Then where does the conception of laws of nature come from? An alternative explanation will be that it's to do with the rise of medieval voluntarism and with medieval discussions about divine sovereignty and God's absolute power and his ordained power. And perhaps the last aspect of it is that it's part of this explanation of why it appears then is that we move from a conception of laws of nature as moral laws that God has ordained to an application of that metaphor to the natural world. And that's precisely what we see in that quote from Descartes that you just put up, that God establishes laws in nature as the same way as a king establishes his laws in the kingdom. And so that it's that move from the moral realm of God ordaining moral laws to the physical realm. So that was just a question.
Yeah, in fact, I think I agree on virtually everything that you said. You can certainly not go directly from the biblical conception to the 17th century. There are intermediate steps, and I quite agree that medieval nominalism is a very important step, so voluntarism. I had a phrase on it in my talk, and then I just decided, I think this morning, to skip it, because I thought if I mention it, then I would need to explain it, and it would be a second talk. And plus, I'm not a medieval scholar, so I'm a little bit. I'm not even a 17th century historian, so it's always difficult to speak of things you have now. But yeah, how I would like to phrase things is that I think you have a consistent biblical worldview of creation. You definitely not have a technical law of nature in the sense that you have a technical philosophical concept from the 17th century on. So I'm not claiming that it would have been sufficient to read the Bible and then you would have had it just so from the very beginning. And I quite agree that you can find both, structures or both elements in the biblical worldview. The idea of law created and natural agency. I think where the difference is with a Greek view is that the natures of things are created and therefore contingent. Now, I know it's a difficult question to see what exactly Aristotle meant and what the medieval scholars meant when they quoted Aristotle, and if the 17th century scientists were right in their understanding of Aristotelian and medieval science. But still, I feel this is a very important point. You need the contingency, which I think you can claim come really into or was brought into European civilization by the concept of creation. And so I would say it comes from the Bible. It's immanent there, or latent, and then certainly medieval voluntarism brought forth or stressed one aspect of the biblical worldview, most of the time in an unbalanced way. So you need some corrective as well. You can't just go for voluntarism in an extreme sense. But then, having said this, it's certainly a forerunner for the 17th century view. So it's the biblical worldview mediated by theological conceptions. Yeah.
Thank you. Next question. Yep, here.
I'd like to have your comment on a possible tension depending on how the phrase universal is read. I'm talking about universal laws. It seems like there's maybe a tension between a strong attachment to universal laws of nature on the one hand and faith in God's saving acts on the other, where that seems to mean, as I suppose based on my induction, localized induction skepticism motivated by divine promise. To give just a few examples, there's Abraham's willingness to believe that God will raise Isaac from the dead if necessary, as Hebrews tells us. Or there's the fact that God sends manna to the Israelites in the desert on Sunday through Friday, but not Saturday, to avoid, to preserve the Sabbath, and they're not to go out and look on the Sabbath day. Or Israel's duty not to be afraid of much more powerful armies because the Lord would fight for them, and that sort of thing. So how would you address this sort of tension? How do we balance the universality on the one hand and faith in a God who acts to save his people on the other?
To be very honest, I haven't really made my mind up on the question, so I can give you my best guess for the moment. I don't think that universal laws or that university of natural laws imply reductionism. So at least this is a position I try to hold, that you have universal laws operating in one domain or in one domain, so say it like this, but it doesn't imply reductionism. And so my view of the universe is definitely a kind of open system, where you have the physical, chemicals. Is it the same realm or not? This is a difficult question. Physicists tend to think it's the same, and chemists tend to think that it's not the same realm. But say the physical, chemical, and then you come to different concepts. You come to a different kind of agency as well when you go to biological entities, and it's even another different realm when you come up to human free agency, and then to divine agency. So I would like to hold together universal laws operating in the natural realm or in the physical realm, if you like, and the possibility of free agency for human beings and also for God. In fact, I think this is what we experience all the time. It might be difficult to explain it, but it's definitely in our experience that we have universal physical laws. Whenever you run a physical experiment, you expect at least the laws to be exceptionalist. But this does not exclude, for example, free human agency. And thus I don't think that it excludes free divine agency.
Next one. More questions? Yes.
Yeah, difficult. I need to make sure that I put this into words. I was interested in your comments about Coulomb's law, and I think when I think about it, that laws in physics, I think in many aspects are essentially always hold and under idealized circumstances. I suspect that that is the way that these laws are being formulated in the first place. And actually, I myself don't know, as practicing physicist, I don't know how Coulomb deduced his law on the basis of his experiments. I think that there must be some quite interesting historical process behind that. I don't know how he did that, but with regard to those idealized circumstances, I think that Coulomb's law holds for point charges. Means those are electrical charges that are very, very small particles. So we have to ignore the size of the particles, because, for instance, if you take suppose that you would take two metal charged spheres. Now, if you take a sphere in isolation, because the charge can float around on the surface of the sphere, it means that if the sphere is far away from other charges, then of course the charges on the sphere are uniformly distributed over its surface. But if you take two of those spheres, if they're far apart, then you can still describe their interaction with Coulomb's law. If you bring those spheres closer together, then obviously the charge on the one sphere is going to affect the charge on the other, so those charges are going to move around, and so that means that you can't describe the interaction between the two spheres in terms of Coulomb's law anymore, but you can still do so if you take the individual point charges on the surface of the sphere, and but then of course you have to take a superposition. You have to take the sum over all the forces between all the individual particles. So you end up with something that is that might be very difficult to describe. But so still, I would say that Coulomb's law would still be valid even in that context, except that you need to be aware of the circumstances. I think with many laws of physics that are in that sense idealized circumstances for which they have been formulated, and I think that's part of their strength. And so it's a little bit of a question or comment that I would have on the basis of what you said.
Yeah, in fact, when I was speaking about idealized, an idealized situation, I was not even addressing this problem, because as far as I remember my physics, these effects just cancel out because of the inverse square law. But yeah, we can talk about this technical point later. But so these are very faint memories of my physics course coming back. But what I was speaking about was that you never have a world with just two electrical spheres. We don't live in this kind of world. Even not in the laboratory. There are a lot of other things going on. You have the atmosphere. You have the Earth magnetic field. You have even the slight electrization of the hairs of the experimenter doing the experiment. And so all these disturbing factors. So we try to cancel them. We try to reduce them, but we can never exclude them from the experiment. So the interesting question, in fact, is to say, how can we formulate a law which, in fact, will never apply in a strict sense? In a certain sense, we never observe Coulomb law at all. We always observe some approximations, etc. And so the very interesting question and is why is modern science, or at least since the 17th or since the 16th century, why is modern science so interested in ideal circumstances? I think as modern scientists, we not even know the history of science, and so things that are obvious for us are not obvious at all. One can see the transition in Galileo writings, that approximation and idealization take a very different role from their time on. A medieval scholar wouldn't have tried to achieve something like ideal circumstances. And so I think this is an aspect of modern science which needs to be explained.
I would agree with that, but I would still say, of course, it's an element of extreme reductionism in one sense, but also say that I think it has done us great service. I
Sure.
think I
Yeah.
think it really works.
Yeah, yeah.
But it works completely still.
Yeah, but so the scientist, in a certain sense, is happy, or I don't know, should I? No, I'm not going to speak about the engineers because it might be tricky. But say the scientist, many times, is just happy if a law works or if a certain kind of methodology works. As a philosopher of science, you want to know why it works, and the difficulties come in at that point.
I think John Polkinghorne might have something interesting here on wanting to sort of capitalize on all the uncertainty rather than the idealized and ontologize the uncertainty, which would be a kind of rather different view. But we'll hear about that next week. Yeah.
Could I ask you about the creating of laws of nature with purpose? You might think if you had a loving God, we might assume he has, or the person of God and the mind of God could choose what the potential laws might finish up being. So you say to yourself, okay, we might have some laws that are reasonably benign laws. Now, the history of the human race is that the laws of nature are extraordinarily cruel. There can be little doubt about that. So we live in a cruel world, fundamentally, in terms of the laws of nature. And human beings have only survived by their ability to secure themselves in safety and so on, almost from the laws of nature, basically. And so there's a difficulty here, I think, because you go back and you say, great, we're making this claim about, this wonderful creator, and we've got sustenance, sustaining laws of nature, but my God, what a cruel setup. And then we're going to claim it's a God of love. So it seems to me we're in some difficulties here. And you have not talked about the purposes, because we have to assume if God is all-powerful, he could choose the particular set of circumstances or potential. I think John Perkin will talk about potential in there. And he might choose what we might call benign and loving potential. What actually the outcome has been is quite independent of the agency of human beings, a very, very cruel setup. And is clearly going to be one in which we're all going to die, or that's to say the human race is going to die. Now, I think there's an obligation on anybody talking about the creation being in terms of laws of nature to say something about why have we got the wretched set of laws of nature that are causing so much cruelty.
Well, a massive question.
Otherwise, it seems to me, where are we getting? Where are we getting,
Richard Swinburne's talk next week.
Yes, exactly. Pass the buck.
Well, a very unfair question. But, have argued this case, I think we've got to say, what are the purposes of these laws of nature? Given us what we know, what are the purposes of these laws of nature, given now what we know, the history through evolution, and the likely outcome of all this lot is going to be?
Okay, I would say it's another talk, but perhaps just some ideas. It's not a complete answer. First, I think we need to distinguish between natural evil and moral evil. It seems obvious, and I am a Westerner, it seems obvious to us that the death of an animal is evil. It might not be as obvious as that this is really evil. And I realize that in different cultures, or even say people working in agriculture, they have a different relationship to animal death, for example, than somebody living in an urbanized city where we only see dead animals, say, in our plate, and we really don't want to imagine where they come from. So not all of what we call evil is evil, or at least might be evil. So this is one point. And the second point is this is the one point I wanted to make. So there is a second point, is that at least in the biblical outlook, we are living in a world where something has gone wrong. So it's not just laws of nature and the beautiful harmony of Genesis 1. There is Genesis 3. So I know that this is a very difficult question, how to link this with history, but this is part of the biblical outlook. We are not living in a beautiful, harmonious world. Having said this, so yeah, this was my third point. My second point is, might it not be that human beings achieve some good in living in a world which is not completely hospitable to them? Might it not be that this is part of our duty, of our stewardship, to dominate the earth, or to subdue the earth? So I see the problem, but I don't think that it's a knockout argument.
Well, that is a massive problem, and we'll have a whole day on it next week, which for those who are going to be here next week is well and good, of course, but perhaps not for the other others.
One of the answers that might likely to become, what do you think, from your perspective, if we could ask the chairman, from your perspective, what would you say to us on that one? Because it's a very, very, I mean, you all know in presenting the gospel to other people, it's a really fundamental problem for us, without a shadow of a doubt. How can you have a loving God at the same time as all this cruelty, which appears to be independent of human beings? In effect, there's almost nothing you can do about it. Now, it's a really difficult problem to answer.
Yeah.
And we can't get around it, you know, and I don't hear any, well, maybe you're going to get next week, but, you know, theologically, I think it's a very difficult issue, and our, for want of a phrase, Her Majesty's opposition has got a field day on this one.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a massive lot. Well, did you want to say that?
Just one or two points. I'm not a biologist. What I, or not even a doctor. What I heard is that the process of aging and dying is far from clear, the mechanism. So I'm not quite sure if we can really say today that the process of aging is just a consequence, for example, of the basic fundamental physical laws. I don't know enough about it. Perhaps people in this room know more about it, or certainly people in this room know more about it than I do, but perhaps you should not jump too, make a too sharp a transition from the physical fundamental law and say a world in which these laws operate, you have necessarily aging and decay and dying. And then another point, so when it comes to cosmology, so people saying, but why did God create a world which eventually will die out? So first, it's a huge extrapolation from our current physical knowledge. So this, I think, we should be a little bit humble about it. It's an informed guess, but it's not more than that. And then perhaps this world is not meant to be sustained for another 50 billion years. So perhaps it's just not important what would happen if the world were sustained for another 50 billion years. So we might be after false problems as well. It's not a complete answer to your question. In fact, personally, I believe that there is no answer to the question of evil, and I even believe that this is a very strong argument in favor of biblical theism, but yeah, this would be another talk to explain it to you. But we can talk about it later on.
Yes, I think I mean it is a massive topic, obviously, and I think we have to move on. Yep.
Your question does provide a tuning of the laws of physics, which are necessary for life, and they talk about anthropic fine-tuning coincidences. You were explaining, I think, that the understanding for the early modern scientists, and so that when Newton said, for example, the world might have been otherwise than it is, it was therefore no necessary but a voluntary and free determination that it should have been thus. That was something pattern and order is. My impression is that many modern physicists are looking somehow for a necessary form of the laws of physics which can be deduced from pure reason.
Yeah.
Maybe string theorists are in we should be looking in the same empirical way that the early physicists were.
Yeah.
Do you think that a biblical view of the nature of physical law could be relevant for modern physics as well?
I really place the break in the 16th century science between, say, Aristotelian and medieval science and modern science in the 20th century, for example, in physics. But I still think that it's the same game we are playing. And I don't and in physics, for example, you get to know very well 17th century physics, but you don't get to know Greek and medieval science. All in fact, what I learned, the little I learned about Greek and medieval science, I learned it during my philosophy studies, my theology, my philosophy studies. I didn't learn it during my physics studies. So I think that the break is really in the 16th, 17th century with forerunners in the Middle Ages, to be sure. It's not completely discontinuous. So therefore, I think that basically the same mythology is still in place, and therefore what you can show for the 17th century is also valid for the 20th or 21st century. There are significant changes, and some people claim that it brings you back to a kind of a more oriental view of the world. I'm not very happy with this, but yeah, it would be another argument. Just on the very question of necessary explanations of natural order, I think that it's very striking to observe this tendency. I've done some work on John Wheeler and on Lee Smolin, who are both, in a certain sense, after a kind of theory of everything, and theory of everything including the shape of natural order. And in both cases, I think it's easy, in fact, to show that at one point or another they distort the scientific data, although they really know better because they're both first-class scientists. But when it comes to a metaphysical or philosophical explanation of what they are doing and trying to get this theory of everything, they have not only to go beyond the scientific data, but in fact they have to distort scientific data. And then I think the interesting question is to say, but why is there this tendency? Why do we want something like an explanation, a necessary explanation of natural order, even coming from atheists? Yeah, Lee Smolin is atheist. John Wheeler, it's more difficult to say what he is, but stay with Lee Smolin. And then my interpretation, but yeah, as a Christian, is to say this is part of the religious drive in a person, and if she does not go for a theistic explanation of natural order, she will try to find it somewhere else, and she will try to find it in nature, and therefore force nature to become a necessary being, although it's not, and then distort scientific data.
Good, thank you very much. Now I spotted a hand. Oh, was that next at the back? Yep.
I wanted to follow on from something that Peter asked you, and that was about the way in which there is still freedom within laws. And what is inspiring to me is the way that just a few natural laws can give rise to such a diversity and such a variety of different things, particularly that there are examples of this in mathematical modelling, where just a few rules can give rise to very sophisticated behaviour, for example, fish shoaling. And there are, of course, the examples that we now see from evolution, where we have speciation, very complex species behaviour, and plasticity of species becoming other species. And this is all within the framework of the natural laws. So what is interesting to me is the fact that just a few of these natural laws, which I believe God has created for us, yet give free will. And your examples were all pre-Darwin, whereas now we can see that there is much more freedom maybe within this structure than the those scientists of the 17th century would have realised. To what extent does your biblical study enable you to talk about the freedom within the framework, which didn't come through, I think, from the biblical quotes?
Yeah. My exams are not pre-Darwinian, they're all physical, not biological. So, although, yeah, incidentally, they're also pre-Darwinian because they're 17th century. I distinguish quite sharply, to be honest, the issue of indeterminacy and the issue of freedom. I don't think that quantum mechanical indeterminacy or, say, chaos theory allows us to explain human freedom. So it was not your point, so I'm a little bit on the side of it. Tried to make sense of what you said and what I could contribute. So I think we have to distinguish between indeterminacy and freedom. And I'm still not convinced that you can get out freedom out of a completely reductionist worldview. So if you really say all that there is are the physical basic laws, I'm not convinced that you really get out complex behavior and especially human freedom. The only argument I see for this is to say that people say, but just look, we are in a world where there is freedom. But then my answer is, we don't know that we are in a reductionist world. We don't know if we are in the world where the physical laws are all the laws that there are. I think you need something like top-down causality. You need a feedback from the system to the lower level. If the lower level is all that there is, I don't think that you get out something like complexity and freedom. So how does the biblical worldview links to this? I haven't really thought about it. It definitely links to the question in the sense that you can show that there are different orders of created things. I don't think that you have to go for the medieval view of the hierarchy of beings, so a scale of beings ranging from potential, not real things, yeah, and then going through even more actual things going up to God. I don't think that this is the correct view, but you still get the idea of a multi-facet or a not multi-layered, because this is still hierarchical, a creation with different domains. And therefore I think this gives you, especially you can see it most obviously for human beings who are set apart. Yeah? So you get a view of a multidimensional reality. Probably the best I can do is to point to the philosophy of science proposed by Hermann Dooyeweerd. This is what I'm thinking about. I don't know if it's familiar to you, but for me it's a kind of explanation or trying to get out of the biblical worldview a non-reductionist and multidimensional reality.
Thank you. Maybe one last one, because I see our next speaker is here and we will need a little break. So I think Subrata.
My question is, do you think that idea of law in science is more appealing, more universal, more open compared to the idea of law in religion? Well, background to the question is that, in science, take the example of physics, people don't say it is Newtonianism or Einsteinism. They call it physics, pursuit of truth in understanding of the physical world. But in religion, in the camp of religion or in religious sphere, how do you describe ourselves? We call Buddhism, Taoism, Jainism, Sikhism, Christism or Christianity, etc. So, and I am kind of disturbed when people say it is biblical God. It cannot be British, atom or American quark. It is quark or atom. So, in a way, our faith makes us more closed, more exclusive, less open, but idea of law in science makes us more open. At least there is less chance of fight between a Hindu physicist and a Muslim physicist and a Christian physicist rather than people of faith from different traditions. I mean, did you think from that angle? I mean, I know this question comes from the opposite camp, which I did not necessarily belong to, but sometimes I think there is some element of truth in this.
Okay, why is science so universal as activity compared to religion? First of all, I would like to make it clear that I don't think that you need to be a Christian in order to be a good scientist. What I wanted to show is that in the 17th century, during the birth period of modern science, the Christian, or say the biblical view, played a dominant role and contributed some very important elements to the scientific activity. It doesn't mean that it contributed all of the elements. I think there are other influences and we wouldn't have to speak about it, but it contributed some important elements. But so in a certain sense it gave you the framework where the scientific activity was born. But once it was born, it could be adopted by people from very different religious convictions or even by atheists. So now, is there a difference between a Christian doing science and a Hindu doing science or an atheist doing science? It's difficult to tell. Perhaps not, but sometimes I think it makes a difference. When I read Lee Smolin and John Wheeler, it's true, it's not about their science, it's about their philosophy and metaphysics. It definitely made a difference to their way of construing or harmonizing, uniting scientific data. Now, the question is, why is science so universal in activity, whereas religion seems to split us? First of all, I would like to say that perhaps the difference is not as strict as you described it. Because science is a united activity, because it's a very controlled community. You have to gain access to it. You have to go through I think in the new Bologna process, it's something 8 or 9 years of formal training. Before that, you don't have the right to call yourself doctor, and you have to sit for exams. And so even up to a very advanced stage of your career, there is very tough control on who is allowed into the community and who is not allowed into the community. And plus, it's a community which is united. If you say today, but if you look throughout the human history, there is very much diversity in the scientific community, or what you could call science, say in the ancient Greece, for example. But still, I agree that there are differences, and I would think that they come from the fact that science is a more, it's far away from existential questions. I'm not saying it's divorced from existential questions, but I would say it's far away from the heart, if I can use the metaphor. Whereas religion really involves, from the beginning to the end, your very existential life and death questions. So your general worldview becomes much more and more important, and you become more and more involved in it existentially. And therefore, I think it's more difficult to change religious worldview than, say, to change a scientific theory. But still, it's possible to change, even in religion. So I think it's a difference of degree. It's not a difference in quality. But still, there is a difference of degree, and I would link it to the more existential questions you ask in religion.
Thank you very much. So I think we'll stop there and have a 5-minute break, just get a glass of water.